Today what we're going to be talking about is this thing called Redux. Has anyone heard of Redux before?
Yeah. It's,
What is it?
Chemistry. It's kind of like before React introduced this new state hook, so people use Redux as the state management.
Okay. Good. So also before the whole use state hook came out, another thing that people were using were actual class components, right? So each component kind of was able to manage its own state, and we can kind of keep things simple like that. So the question comes when you have a little bit more of a complicated or complex app where you've got a lot of nested components. And our nested components need to know something about the state way beyond their scope, right? They need to know about something that's way out there. And the problem that kind of comes with that situation is that you end up having to pass down information to the next component and to the next component. And all these little components in the middle don't really need to know anything about that state, right? We're just kind of passing it down the line so that the next component has access to it, but it's not really even doing anything with it. So largely the problems that Redux aims to solve are fairly similar to the context API, which we did talk about before. Redux, however, provides a couple of other benefits in that it provides some built-in ways that we can change the global state. Okay, whereas with the context API, we actually have to write our own functions to do that stuff. Also, Redux provides a little bit better guarantees on re-renders, so it's a little bit better in terms of the performance of your app, because essentially each component is only going to re-render when the props of that component has changed. So if we're only interested in some small piece of the global state, we can only re-render when that piece changes rather than when anything changes, on an outer level somewhere. Okay. So let's actually demonstrate this concept. What I'm going to do is I'm going to start up a new React app in our standard way. Make this a little bigger. So let's go to stacks, mern, lectures. Okay. And we're going to create a new React app called, let's see, Redux demo. Creative naming here. And then, so while we're waiting for that, let's talk about what else we're going to need to do this demo. We're going to be bringing in a couple libraries. What do you think they are?
Course.
What?
Course.
Course? Oh, cores. No. This is going to be strictly a front-end application. We will have no backend. Yeah. Well, we need Redux, right? So this is not built into React. It is a separate library, and it can also be used with different frameworks as well. It's not React specific. However, Redux also has an official library for React that we're also going to install as well. So let's do that. Let me go into this. Actually, let me code it. So Redux demo. Okay, cool. Let me open up my terminal here and let's install these two libraries. So we'll say, make that a little bigger, npm I. We're going to install Redux and also React-Redux. Someone locked it. Oh, there we go. Isaiah. If you ever get locked out, you can pull up on the handle. For some reason, it's weird like that.
For the Redux and React Redux, like are these two inclusive? Like they have like some sort of overlap?
A sort, is that what you said?
No, I mean like a sort overlap on the functionalities.
No, they're completely different. So Redux, again, is just the actual state management library. React Redux is set up so that we can incorporate Redux inside of our React app. So in theory, and I don't know how true this is, but I would imagine they probably also have like an official library to integrate Redux with Vue. And I'm pretty sure same thing for Angular. Yeah, exactly. I don't know why this is taking so long to install. All right. Anyway, while that's doing that, let's take a look at what we've got inside our source folder. So we've got our main app component, right? And what I want to do is basically set it up so that we can create some sort of global state. Because again, that's what this is designed to solve, is in the case where we've got a lot of nested components, we're going to want those deeply nested components to be able to access and change some state outside somewhere, right? Okay. So in order to make this work, what we generally want to do is we want to wrap our application with this component which React Redux provides. It's called a provider component. Okay? So inside here, I'm going to say import provider from React Redux. Okay? And the reason why I'm doing it in our app component is because this is going to be some sort of global state, and I basically want to wrap our entire application with this provider, so we have access to it from anywhere inside our component tree. And for now, I'm just going to rip out all this other stuff that we have. Okay, and then I'm going to drop in this provider component. Okay. What the provider component needs to have is it needs to have something called a store attached to it. Okay, so I need to say store, and then I'm going to set that equal to what's essentially our central state store. So this is like the centralized place where we're housing all of our global state data. Okay. Now the question is, well, how do I create this store that I need, right? Because I'm going to have to create it if I'm going to use it here. So we're going to need a couple steps here. I am going to import a function from Redux called createStore that will allow us to make this. So createStore from Redux. Let's see if this is done installing. Yes, it is. Cool. All right, so let's go ahead and run this app. npm start. Okay, so I've got the createStore function. Now, obviously, we're going to want to invoke that function to create our store, right? So let's do that. So let's say const store equals create store. And I'm going to call this function. So the question is, what do we need to provide to create store? This is where things get a little funky, and you guys will kind of have to follow along, because it'll seem a little weird. The first thing that we're going to pass this create store function is what's called a reducer function. Okay? And what the reducer function's job is its job is to take the current state, the current global state of our app, and some action that we provide to it. An action is going to be an object, which we'll see in a little bit. And then we want to then calculate whatever the new state is going to be after that action is applied. Okay? So in Redux, the idea is, and this is also true of just React in general, we're not mutating the existing state. We're completely creating a brand new state out of whatever this change that we wanted to do is. Okay? So in order for us to invoke this createStore function, we need to create our reducer function, whose job, again, is to take our existing state and whatever the change that we wanted and create a new state from that. So I'm just going to say function reducer, and again, that's going to take in the existing state, and then it's going to take in some action that I'm going to use to alter my state. Okay? And you guys will see if you browse around in the docs of Redux, rather than using if-thens, they typically use switch cases. Are you guys familiar with switch cases at all? Maybe you've seen them before. Right, exactly. It's kind of like we're evaluating something off of some specific number of conditions, right? So we can run a switch case here. And the thing that we pass into that is going to be what are we switching based on? And what we're going to base it on is the type of the action. Okay? So hopefully that's not too confusing. Our action, again, is just going to be an object, which means the type is some property of that object, right? And I think what we're going to do for the purposes of the demo, just to kind of keep it simple, we're just going to have a couple different actions. One of them is going to be log in, another one's going to be log out. So we're going to pretend like we're trying to keep track of some user state here, all right? Okay, so if we have a case, and notice how I'm going to do this all in uppercase, because this is the convention, because these are like constants, essentially. So if I'm logging in, what I want to return is the existing state, and I also want to return this property saying logged in is true. Okay? So you guys remember the old spread operator? Yeah, so we're saying everything in the state is going to essentially stay the same. All we're changing is this one key value pair right here. We're just saying, yeah, now we're logged in. Okay, fair enough. Then we'll say here case log out. We'll essentially do the same thing, right? So let's return an object that has all of the current state in it, and then we'll say logged in is false. Okay. Finally, I'm just going to provide a default here in case the action that we were presented with doesn't meet any of these guys. Let's just return out the existing state, right? As if nothing had happened. So we'll say default return state. Okay, so now we've got this reducer function here, which we needed to calculate a new state based on our existing state and whatever that action was. And we can provide that to our create store function. So here we'll just pass in our reducer. And there's an optional second argument on this create store function, which allows us to determine what is our state to begin with. Where is our starting point, right? So I'm just going to say here, it'll be an object with logged in set to false. So initially we're saying the person's not logged in right now, right? Okay. Now I can take that store that I created and I can pass that in here to the provider's store attribute. All right, cool. So if we open this up in our browser, you guys can see there's nothing there because we have like no inner components actually rendering anything, right? So let's change that. Let's create an inner component. I'll just call it inner.js. Okay, I need to import React from React. Okay. Now we're going to create this component, and the component is actually going to take in the logged in part. Okay. Now notice one thing to keep an eye on. We're not going to provide it directly inside here. We're not going to like provide that as a prop. You guys know why or have any idea why that is? So when I put this inner component in here, there won't be a prop with logged in or whatever. Where do you think we're going to get that? going to come from this provider. Okay? That's what Redux is going to allow us to do. We don't have to explicitly pass it in here at this level, but we'll see how we're going to get a hold of it.
So then states at a provider level allow it to be provided to anything before.
Correct. So this, whatever we have in our store here, will now be accessible by anything inside of this provider.
Oh, okay. So things will pass provider, provider.
Yeah, yeah. So that's sort of like our big wrapper surrounding the
So
app.
it's like based on the structure, it's work the same way as the context.
As context. Yeah. Yes, in fact, and that's kind of why I wanted to point out some differences there, is that with Redux, we actually have a built-in mechanism to change the state. Context doesn't have that built in, but we can build functions that would change the state for us in context.
So like change the state from the inner component.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you'd have to make your own functions to do that, whereas with Redux, that's kind of like built in. Okay. So let's pretend like we're going to import this. Well, we actually are, but down here, let's just import our inner from .inner. Okay. And then inside this inner, as I was saying, we're going to take in this prop called logged in. So we'll say const inner equals a function, and then I'm going to destructure logged in right here. Okay, and then I'm just going to have a simple question in here. Basically, we're going to ask, is the person logged in? So we'll say if logged in, then we're going to present them a button that will allow them to log out, right? So we'll say return button log out. Okay. Obviously, I'm going to need to have some kind of a click handler in there, and we're not going to do that just yet, but we'll get there. So if we get past here, we can just return a button that will say login, right? Okay, button log in. Cool. All right. Now, typically what we would do at this point is we would just export this guy, right? That would be what we would do. However, we know that by itself we don't have access to this logged in, right? Which means that we're going to need to do a little bit of extra work here. So I'm going to import something from React Redux called connect. And what this function will allow us to do is it will allow us to connect this inner component to our global state so that we can go and either grab some things from it or also make some changes to it. So instead of just exporting default inner, I'm going to export default, and I'm going to invoke this connect function. Okay? The connect function will return another function, which I can then invoke against my inner component. Okay? But I'm not completely finished here. Inside this, when I call the connect function, I also need to provide it some information about which things in our global state am I interested in. Okay? And in this case, there's only one thing that I'm curious about. I want to know about that logged in state, right? So I'm going to create, and actually later on, I'm going to show you guys kind of like a simpler way of doing this too, because there are alternative ways of handling this. Right now, you can see that we're kind of wrapping our inner component in a way. There's another way using hooks that's like a little bit easier to use, I think. So what I want to do is I want to create a function here that will say, from my global state, these are the pieces that I'm interested in. Okay? So typically what you'll see this function referred to is something like map state to props. Okay? And what that's going to do is it's going to take the state, and I'm going to return out an object that has whatever properties I'm interested in. So I can say return an object that has a property called logged in. What do you guys think the value of that will be? State.logged in. Yeah, exactly. Good. Okay. So now when I pass this to the connect function, map state to props, that will allow my inner component to actually have access to this specific prop, right? Logged in. Okay. So let's see if this is working so far. Let's just let's save this. Take a quick look here. Did I do something wrong? Oh, I forgot to save this. Okay, cool. So I've got this log in button. That's good. Let me get rid of this logo because we're not using that. Okay, so I've got this login button. Good. So that means that I'm not currently logged in, right? Perfect. All right, so let's add some actual event listeners to these buttons so that when we click them, we can change that state, right? Okay. Now, in order to change the state, I need to use this thing called a dispatch function. So the dispatch function, its job is to take in an object that our reducer is going to use. So let's glance at our reducer real quick. Remember this action object right here? So when we call the dispatch function, we need to provide it an action object which sort of describes what is the state change that we're trying to achieve. Okay? So let's do that. So my component is going to take in a dispatch function. Okay? Where do you guys think I'm going to get that from? Or where do you think maybe that's coming from? It's coming from us invoking this connect function. Okay? And optionally, you can provide a second function here which would map the actual dispatch function to some actions that you want to create. We're not going to do that because I want to keep things like a little bit simpler too. But that's another option as far as using it. Okay. So I've got this dispatch function here, which means that I can say when the login is clicked on, what I want to do is I want to dispatch an action. Okay? And the type, what do you guys think the type should be based on our reducer function? Should be login, right? That's that case right there. Okay. Good. Just do this a little bit, improve the readability. Okay, cool. So that's for our login case. If we're logging out, we want to kind of do, wait, did I do that wrong? Oh, no, I didn't. Okay, so for logging out, not all caps. Okay, we want to do the same type thing, right? We want to dispatch an action object, and then the type this time is going to be what? Log out. Okay. So let's see if we're getting the behavior that we're expecting here. There we go, right? So I click on it, my login state is changing constantly. All right. So that might not really seem that amazing, but what's really cool about this is that if we're assuming that our inner component is somehow nested much deeper inside of a component tree, we're now able to sort of interact with our global state and change it very easily, right?
Out of curiosity, so does the connect walk out the hierarchy until it finds a provider that has that property? Or does it just walk up to the first thing and then tries to fetch it? It's not there.
I think your intuition on that's correct, because you can technically have more than one provider. I mean, it wouldn't really be the best idea, because it's sort of the way that this is designed is so that we have one store that's sort of maintaining our global state. Yeah, but you could do it if you wanted. Yeah. All right. So as I told you before, there actually is an easier way to interact with this rather than having to call this connect function and doing the map to state props, which I'll show you guys as well using React hooks. Okay. So what we want to do is, rather than importing connect, what we can import are a couple other functions here. So I can, let me just comment that out. I can say import use dispatch, okay, and then also use selector from React Redux. Okay, so if I'm importing these guys, I don't need to actually take these in anymore, so I can change that. So let me just get rid of these here. Okay, now the question is, how do I get dispatch? Well, because I'm going to need that function, right? I can use this use dispatch hook to grab a hold of this dispatch function. So I can say const dispatch equals use dispatch. Okay, so that's actually going to return me the dispatch function that I need. And then another change we can make down here, because we're no longer going to be doing this connect stuff, is I'm just going to comment out that, and we'll say export default inner. Okay. The other thing that I need to get a hold of is I need to get a hold of that logged in state, right? Because I want to know, is this person currently logged in? So this is where our use selector hook is going to come into play. You guys notice how all the hooks start with use? Yeah, so that's the convention, and if you ever create your own custom hooks, which you can do, always have that as the first part of the name. Use whatever it is. Okay. So here, we're trying to get a hold of logged in. And the way that we're going to do it is we're going to call this use selector hook. Can anyone guess what the use selector hook might take? That's a good guess. Takes a callback function. Yeah, our favorite, right? So I'm just going to create a little function here that takes in the state, and it returns out state.loggedIn. So whatever piece of the state that we're looking for here, we just want to pull that from the state, right? So let's save that. Let me go back to our project here, and let's see, just do a hard refresh, make sure everything's still working right. Still working exactly the same, right? So I can log in, log out, and so forth. It's a little bit simpler to use, I guess, in the sense that we don't have to run all the connect business down below. We don't have to do map dispatch, or sorry, map state to props, that kind of thing. I don't know. Kind of nice. Do you guys find that you prefer kind of one of these ways to the other?
This one's better.
This is better.
This is better.
Yeah, I like it better too.
So I'm not really
Using
lost.
hooks.
What does dispatch do again?
So what dispatch does is it takes in some action that we create,
Right.
and it then, our reducer uses that action to calculate what the next state is going to be. Okay? So I think what we'll do, actually, we'll kind of make this a little bit more robust. Rather than having log in and log out, what if we have like a user object or something like that, right?
So I guess like maybe it's because my confusion is like just using the out of the box use dispatch.
Like this hook is confusing me? Like
Well,
what?
yeah, because you're not giving anything. You're saying use dispatch equals box dispatch.
Okay, yeah. It's like why are we even doing this, right?
Yeah.
Well, the reason why we have to do it is because dispatch by itself, if we were to just like import that from Redux, it's not actually being like it needs to have some context, right? It needs to be inside of a React component. So that's why it's important for us to actually call this hook. Otherwise, we wouldn't be able to use it as is. It has to be done inside the actual React component. Because this is ultimately it's this function that's going to be called, right? So it requires that context. Yes.
You mentioned that when you use the reducer, so
Yeah.
it will just create new state. And
Yeah.
does that mean the
Yeah. Notice here that we're returning these objects, right?
yeah, does that mean like the state will become bigger and bigger? So in a sense, each time you change it, you will have a new state.
Nope.
No?
No, because all I'm doing is I'm taking whatever exists currently in the state, and then I'm changing this one property. That's it. I'm not really adding to it, right? Because this property was already in that initial state that I specified. So it's not like continually, yeah.
So I guess then also like why add to the state rather than like the use state function to update it?
Use state works perfectly fine for local component state. But what if it's something that's on a much larger level? Like, let's say I've got this app that's multi-pages because I'm using Reach Router or something like that, right? And I always want to know who that user is. Do I want to provide a user prop to every single one of those routes manually? Probably not. And then because those views may also have lots of subcomponents. And then inside those subcomponents, maybe I want to be able to log someone in or out, right? Same thing with like a shopping cart. I may want to have some access to that global state in some inner component. So that's sort of the purpose of the whole global state thing is I don't want to just keep passing down these props through all these intermediary components that don't really even need to use it, right?
I mean, like that makes sense. But like, I guess maybe I'm using it because going back to React, you had like the state and then the use state, which you use the use state to modify the states, and this way it causes a refresh on everything. Right? But then over here, we're just saying modify the state itself instead of using a use state to allow for the life cycle to occur. Like, yeah, unless like this is a different concept of state, where it's just like a collection of properties that you just want.
Well, yeah, the concept of state is this is a global concept, right? It's like we've got this centralized store that's holding all of this information as opposed to just the component holding its state. And you can still use state in conjunction with this. It's just the idea behind Redux is that you've got a central store. It's like a central source of truth, essentially, right?
Okay.
For the major things that your app needs. Now, if it's something that's just specific to that component, yeah, you probably don't even need to like hook into Redux for that, right?
Okay, I think I did that.
Yeah.
Because like this is like a different concept. Because like with the use state functionality was really catered to that component. So this way, that component has its own life cycle. Because if we treated it as a global use state life cycle, that means every single time that changes, it'll cause it to be rendering for any other
Right.
component.
Yeah, and so the idea here, though, is that we don't want to re-render based on some things in the state that we're not actually interested in.
Okay.
So we only want the re-rendering to happen if that logged-in state has changed, right? Okay. All right, so let's tweak our reducer slightly. Instead of doing logged in, let's actually create a user object of some sort. Okay. So when we log in, I'm going to change user to, let's say action.user. Okay, and then down here, when I log out, let's just set user to null. Okay, and then down here for our initial state, Let's set user null because we know that we're not logged in initially, right? And then inside my inner, instead of checking logged in, now what I want to do is I want to just grab the user information, right? So I'll change this to user. And then we'll say if there's a user, then we can log out. Otherwise, we want to log in. So let's do something like we're dispatching a type of login, and then let's also provide some user information, right? So we'll say the user is going to be name Bob Smith, email bob@smith.com. Okay. And then if we're logged in, maybe we'll want to display that on the screen somewhere, right? So let's just, I'll create a little fragment in here so that we can actually have more than one thing. Okay, and then we'll just do p-tag name. What's that going to be? User.name. Duplicate that down. Email. It's going to be this. Okay, cool. Everything should be okay, right? All right, let's see what happens when we log in. Cool. There's Bob Smith. If I log out, nothing. Now, obviously, this isn't very dynamic because we're actually hard coding in some user information. But the point is, I wanted you guys to see that when we dispatch an action, we can also optionally add some additional properties for the reducer to change. So in this case, we want to change the state of the user, right? And in your app, you know, if you were logging somebody in, you wouldn't hard code this. You would actually take whatever the the login information was, probably from your backend. So you'd send a call to your backend. The backend would say, okay, yes, this user is good, and his name is Bob Smith, and his email is this, right?
Can we use the React development tool from the browser to see the change of the state?
Yeah, I would imagine we could do that because we're using hooks here, right? I haven't actually tried that, but let's take a look. So if we go components, I've got my inner. So here's my context provider, and let's see. It looks like we can take a look at our store here. Oh, but that's just showing our get state function. Subscribe. If we look at our inner, what do we have here? Store. Okay, so there's our dispatch function. Selector, Redux context, store, subscription. Seems like it's in there somewhere. It's kind of a little hard to dig into, though. Yeah. But if you guys notice, this is kind of interesting. Dang it. I'm trying to unhighlight. Notice how we've got like this. We've got our app, we've got our provider component, which we explicitly put inside of our app. Then we've got this context.provider, and then this inner here. What does that kind of tell us that Redux is doing?
It's using the context.
It's actually using the context API under the hood, right? Kind of funny. Yeah, sneaky. But again, it kind of gives us some built-in ways for us to make changes to the state, which the context by itself does not. We have to write our own functions to make changes to the state. Okay. So to review, the main idea here of Redux is that we have a reducer function which just takes in the existing state and some action that we provide, and then using that action and the existing state, we return out some modified state in whatever way that we want. Okay. So again, we're never mutating the existing state. We're simply providing a new state for the app to have. Okay. I think what I'll do is I'll post this code up for you guys too, just so you can like play with or whatever. Any other questions about how this works? Global state.
Will this work the same way on Gatsby or Next.js?
What was the second thing you asked about? I know Gatsby. What was the second one? Oh, next. That's a good question. I'm not sure. In terms of Gatsby, I think you would need to wrap your. I want to say there's a function that would allow you to wrap the server-side rendered version of the app as well. Yeah. Also.
The other two, they were like both client-side rendering and
Yeah.
server-side rendering.
Yeah, exactly. So I think you need to wrap your. There's something you can do. I think in the Gatsby config where you can wrap the entire app with something on the server render as well.
So
I think that's what you would need to do.
Sort of like what we're doing on the Create React app. We have this app.js file. So
Mhm.
sort of like doing something like that.
It's a similar concept, but I think you're going to want to do it in the config file, if I remember correctly. Yeah. Let me know if you find anything out about that too. Yeah, and I'll do the same. All right. Okay, cool. Thanks, guys.